Welcome to the SQOLOGY Podcast. Many thanks to ResoNix Sound Solutions for making this podcast a reality. There's a link in the show notes, but you can find out more about ResoNix Sound Treatments, along with tons of other info, resources, and products at ResoNixSoundSolutions.com. Now on with the show. Today we're with Ekern. Eric, welcome.
Thanks, Clifton. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
We've kind of known each other off and on throughout the industry and over the years, and I know your path has woven back and forth quite a bit. I don't remember that you were maybe so involved on this end of the sound quality spectrum at that point, but it seems like you've definitely dove in here recently. But to get a kind of a background from you, what was your start in car audio in the first place?
Well, before I start that, I wanted to give a little disclaimer. I am not an audio engineer. I'm not a doctor of acoustics. I am a avid hobbyist turned professional that I've been installed my first car stereo, I think, in 1992. So I picked up a few things along the way, and I just hope that I can give something back. Try to keep my terminology clean. Please don't blast me if I get something wrong or whatever.
For sure.
But, with that, I've always kind of been drawn to electromechanical devices. One of my earliest memories was about 1979, 1980. My parents' neighbor had me over. We were over there for dinner or something. I remember going into his basement, and he had this huge N-scale model train layout. And I was just completely enamored, kind of mesmerized with these little, the N-scale engines are a couple inches long, and just how they worked and the electricity going through the track and all that kind of stuff. And just through my childhood, that always was kind of a common thread. I remember my mom bringing home an erector set from a rummage sale when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And I was like, ooh, this is so cool. And I developed erector set PTSD because a lot of the pieces were missing. I couldn't finish any of the projects. And that just kept growing. My brother was kind of a nerdy guy, was into electricity and stuff with some of his buddies. They made a shock machine where we would sit around in a circle and hold hands, and it'd shoot electrical current through all of us, and all our muscles would flex, and not realizing how dangerous that was. Right. I think they used a modified power supply out of an amplifier or something. And
oh my.
Just really unusual stuff.
Right.
So anyways, got into radio controlled cars, another electromechanical thing, just, batteries. I didn't realize back then that I was dealing with pulse width modulation and, learning about just all these different mechanical things.
Sure.
Moving forward, I think it was... I got heavier into radio control, and I really started fabricating stuff. I think I built my first radio controlled nitro boat kit when I was about 14. It was a wood kit, pulled it out of the box, and I was expecting like these pre-molded wood things that I kind of just glued together, and it was a box of sticks. So I was in my bedroom with an X-Acto knife and a piece of sandpaper and put together this kit, and had a nitro engine on it, and eventually it went on the water and float, and actually I still have it, kind of funny. That turned into kind of, coming of age when everyone has that moment where, well, it's kind of like the movie you see where the junior high kid's walking down the hallway in high school and for the first time, and he sees the senior girl, and you hear the music start playing, and he kind of stares at her and walks into somebody's locker door,
Right.
I had that moment. There was a store called Team Electronics in our local mall. And I remember I was with some of my buddies. We were probably like 12, 13 years old. And we were screwing around. We ran in the store. We had no idea what it was. And we ended up in the car audio room. And I remember looking over, and there's all these green chiclets staring at me. And I was like, it was a stack, every Alpine model in the line at the time.
Right.
And I remember all of a sudden, and there literally was rock and roll playing in the background. And all of a sudden the salesman walks in here, and he's like, you guys can't be in here. So kind of got kicked out, but it kind of sparked my interest. Then I turned, 16, and I got my first car, and it was a 1980 Ford Fairmont. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the ugliest car you've ever seen. Had the 100% authentic imitation leather.
Right.
Big bench seat in the front. And it just had a broken AM radio in the dash. And I'm like, well, this isn't cool. Grunge was out and everyone wanted to listen to music. And I'm like,
Right.
I got to figure out how to do a stereo. So I think I got a 2-shaft cassette deck from a rummage sale and put that guy in. And of course, it just had one dash speaker. And I'm like, well, I got to get some speakers. So I went to Best Buy. At the time, Best Buy, it was affordable. I think I got some Wizardcone Pioneer 6x9s for like $29 or something like that. Set them in the rear deck, like you saw so much in the 80s. I had no idea. And eventually cut them into the rear deck and kind of started thinking, well, I was getting more and more into sound. Well, I want some front speakers. So I actually built my first enclosure, and it was out of some planks that my dad had in the garage. And I did have enough wood for the sides. I think I used like a handsaw to cut it, kind of make a rectangle,
Rectangle-ish.
And so, rectangle-ish. I don't even know what I used to screw it together. But there was some, I found a cardboard box and cut that up to finish the box. And I had it was my first center console and my first, enclosure all at the same time. And I didn't even know it. I was using passive radiators on the side with the cardboard that resonated like crazy. And, I just thought it sounded great.
That's funny.
Well, that eventually, I then discovered this store called Sound World, which was the local stereo shop.
And where
and I started. This is in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Okay.
I should have told. Yeah, I'm a Midwest boy.
Okay.
Born and raised for the most part. La Crosse, Wisconsin. Find this store called Sound World, and I walk in, and it's just like a whole nother level. They have, at that time, Alpine CD changers were big, and they had them. The paint mixer with the CD changer, the clear CD changer sitting on top.
Yeah.
So you turn it on and you can see the cartridge in there. It's just perfectly balanced and there's no skipping. And, I walk into their sound room and they got these big Rockford Fosgate rock boxes. And I was just like hooked. So I became that annoying customer that showed up to see what came in from UPS that day.
Right.
And I remember the first time they're like, maybe you should work here, and it was just kind of a joke at the time. But eventually I did get a job there in 1994. I finally got hired. I had interviewed there a couple times, but it was for a home audio job. I did custom home audio for them. And I'm actually really glad it worked out that way because it expanded my horizons quite a bit.
For sure.
If I had just gone straight into car audio, it just would have gone down that tunnel. And having a home background really helped. And over the years I built a pretty substantial home system that my ex-wife now has. But
Dope.
that's a whole nother rabbit hole. We won't go down there. But that led to a lot of really good things. I heard my first DSP. A lot of people talk about 10 or 15 years ago, DSPs have really come into the forefront. In 1993, I think I heard an Alpine 3681, which was a very coarse, had time delay, crossovers, no EQ built in. But I think, it was so low sample rate that the time delay was limited to 0.3 milliseconds. Mm-hmm. So when you hit that baby,
it made a jump.
With like, it went chunk, chunk, chunk. Down, it's like a 6-inch jump every time. But
at least you knew it was doing something.
All of a sudden you had an image in the center, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And then I couldn't afford that at the time. You had to buy their entire system. There's, $800 cassette deck and $800 processor and $800 CD changer to all make it work. But eventually they came out with a processor that worked with some of their other stuff, and I got into that. I built my first set of door panels, or door pods. They weren't full panels. Set of kick panels with some ADS 325s. Had a bunch of Orion HCCA stuff, and I thought it was, I was getting, pretty good at it. And it was one of those things where as you get older, you realize the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, So I've always kind of subscribed to that, you just always got to be learning. I kind of got out of audio for a while. I worked for another big shop down in Milwaukee and ended up getting married. And well, actually, let's backtrack a little bit. That store that I went to work at, you probably know Steve Rogers.
Yes.
Now of Lucas Lighting fame. He was actually the store manager there at the time. And he was really a mentor along with Greg Mitchell, who is the owner of that store. In fact, I just went out to dinner with Greg a couple of weeks ago and caught up. And so I had some really good mentors along the way that really, in fact, that 3681 I was talking about was in Steve's RX-7.
Okay.
That I heard for the first time that he had a full Iasca, competition car. So,
and Steve
anyways,
has a great set of ears. I mean,
he taught me a lot.
He's a good dude.
Yep. Yeah. Captain America. Yeah. I had to help him out at the Tiesto show a couple years ago in Vegas. We got a little crazy, but
you will listen hard and party hard. Those are the two things.
Steve will. I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but yeah, we had anniversary parties at Sound World, and Steve was the instigator. So, Steve, if you're listening, he's laughing right now if he's listening. Sure. But Greg, the owner, in about 2005, I found out I was kind of out of audio, and I didn't really think I was going to be back into it. And I found out he was retiring. Mm-hmm. Greg had done pretty well for himself, and at that time, I had just sold a rental property that I had flipped, and sit with a little cash. And the Sound World name had already been bought, but the person that bought it didn't want to do car audio. So I'm like, I went from not even thinking about being in audio to opening the door of my own store in about 90 days.
Oh my!
So yeah, it was a whirlwind. Fortunately, Greg really worked with me. They were known for their all night sales. Which was a promotion. It was always the weekend or the week between Christmas and New Year's, where everyone had just gotten a bunch of gifts they didn't want. So they, when you return them, all of a sudden you can go buy stereo equipment. So why not have a great deal? He did a final one, and all the car audio that was sold, I was the new install guy. So we were booked, and hit the ground running with remote starts and audio, the moment we opened our door. That was, I think it was October of 2006 when I actually opened. Did really well. I think in 2009, I was one of the early, MECP master certified guys. 2010, I think it was, I went to like Master Tech Boot Camp. Mm-hmm. That year, I think I didn't even know what the industry awards won and all this industry awards were. And all of a sudden I got nominated. This was when, reps nominated you.
Right.
And, I made like top 100 installer, top 50 retailer, from this little shop in La Crosse. And I was, up against guys out of the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And, the reps really took notice. I did that, 2 years on the store and 3 years on the installer. And then I just kind of dropped out because you started having to nominate yourself. And I wasn't
into a popularity contest. So,
yeah. Right. So, and that's not to take away from anybody who's still in those.
Sure.
I mean, obviously they have a huge catalog of work, but it just wasn't my vibe anymore. So anyways, doing really well. I opened another shop where I had fabrication, doing a lot of, big systems. And then, something happened in my personal life in 2015 that really ended up occupying a lot of my time. There was kind of some family tragedy, and I did a lot of caretaking. So I was running a business 6 days a week. And then the other, pretty much any time I had off, I was now doing caretaking. And a year later, my salesperson, who was also my best friend and cousin through marriage, he passed away suddenly. And I lasted for about another year. And I was just, after all of that, I was just burnt out.
Yeah.
Ended up selling the business and took some time off. I was like semi-retired, and after a couple of years of just kind of doing whatever I want, I'm like, I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do when I grow up. So I think it was
I gotta be an adult now. What?
yeah, exactly. So I think it was like August of 2019. About all of a sudden I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go to school. So like 4 days later, somehow I managed to get into the program I wanted, which was an automation program. It's kind of a spin-off of electromechanical, except it's a lot more programming. It's basically robots. Mm-hmm. And got into school, which when you go into school, I think I was like 43 at the time. And, the guys you were in class with are half your age. That's a lot of fun.
A little weird.
Yeah, a little hot. Just one side note, I remember walking into the math class. It was more of an application class that assumed you had a working knowledge of advanced algebra, some trig, some light calculus. And the one guy, after like 3 days, he kind of says, "Man, this is really hard. I haven't had a math class in 2 years." And I'm like,
try 20, buddy.
I haven't had a math class since before you were born. And that was no lie. So,
yeah, for sure.
But then, it was tough. And the AutoCAD class, I was struggling initially, and all these guys are just killing it. And I'm like, man, I'm just off my game. And then I found out about midway through the semester that all these guys had AutoCAD in high school. So this was just a review for them.
Their thing.
Right. And a lot of it was review.
To go from scratch with the beginner class.
Right. Yeah. And then we got into the actual wiring stuff. And all I could think of is when Darth Vader says to Obi-Wan that once I was the student and now I am the master. Right. And I just showed them what was up. So I became kind of like the old guy that actually knew what he was doing. So all these guys were show us how to do this, show us how to do that. And actually, school went really well. I ended up graduating, went through the COVID thing during school, which was a whole interesting scenario. Ended up taking like a $30,000 trainer system home and doing remote, labs and stuff. So the school really figured it out. Yeah. So they put a lot of trust in us. We had to sign a waiver. We had to pick it up like at a drop location because, we couldn't talk to, meet anybody in person or anything like that. So it was, kind of like this black ops thing, but figured it out. Anyways, get through school. And then all of a sudden I had the itch to do car audio again. I'm like, well, you know what? I don't really want to open another business. So I'm going to see what's out there. And I actually went and worked for initially a place in Vegas that was some big names. And I realized, this isn't going to work. And I came back to Wisconsin, and then I got another kind of lead, and I went out, did that. And I realized, I'm working as hard or harder than I was when I was the owner, and I'm certainly not going to benefit like I was the owner. And, there was just some business plan issues that I saw and like, nah, this isn't for me. So I came back to Wisconsin and finally grew up and got a real job. And
first
now
time
I
ever.
work for no more car audio as my primary. I still do it as a side gig, but I got a job for a high-end industrial scale system company and started out as a technician and going through all these companies and calibrating scales. And you don't realize how many scales there are in buildings and how many businesses have them until you're in this business. And did that for about a year and a half, and they've recently moved me into a technical sales role. I now am working with companies like 3M and a very large convenience store chain here locally called Quick Trip. They're like a $7 billion company.
Right.
And I'm their representative for their scale needs, and they have a lot of them. So a lot more responsibility, a lot of bigger dollar amounts, but I can turn it off at the end of the day. So, but what that's allowed me to do is all of a sudden audio is exciting again. So it's now a hobby instead of a profession, and I've really dove into it in a way that I haven't felt, with a level of excitement since I was, building my first sub box, back when I was 16 years old.
For sure.
So,
well, especially with the new background of education and everything else along the way that you're able to pivot and turn into, hey, how can I apply this now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if, and that brings up point, people always ask, especially younger kids, well, what should I go into for schooling? I want to do audio. Is there any schooling? And, with some of the, schools, what is it? Image Dynamics shut down, and didn't another one just shut down recently? Wasn't it the Metro based one or something?
Oh, yeah.
But if you did want to get a degree that was related to car audio and 90% of it was applicable, that automation degree at your local technical college is a good one. Just about everything you learn in there will apply in one way, shape, or form.
I never thought of that. But
So anyhow, that's kind of my background. You get to a point in audio and car audio where you get as much information as you can off of people in the industry. And there's so much of it on, the social media outlets and online and on YouTube and stuff like that. And it gets to a point where, I remember Brian Schmidt telling me, if you want to look at great designs, don't look at car audio pictures. If you want to come up with ideas for your install, don't look at car audio pictures. Go look at concept cars. Go look at stuff outside the industry for inspiration. And I started really looking around to see what else was out there. And recently, I was invited recently to I'm going to do this in my best masterpiece theater voice, the Cross Area Audiophile Association, to listen at. I went to a surgeon's house who had some of the big Magicos and the big bat amplifiers, turntable, all analog. The system, I didn't want to speculate, but it was probably at least $250,000 worth of gear.
Wow.
And, sat around with a bunch of audio nerds for 6 hours and listened to music. And it was a great time. And it reminded me how, I started thinking about how do these speakers sound so good? And even, I used to have some of the Bowers and Wilkins, the 802 Diamonds I think I had. And it's like, how do they get that level of clarity and resolution? And, the speakers aren't, the speakers are maybe 10 to 20% of the cost of those speakers.
Right.
The actual drive units.
Drivers.
The rest of it's the enclosure. And it's like, what did they do to make this sound that good? And it's all about getting rid of the cabinet resonances. So I started really pondering ideas about how to get rid of, those resonances. And, obviously we have sound damping and, but ultimately it doesn't matter how much sound damping you put into a car or your enclosure or how much milkshake you dump in it. If you can put your finger on that enclosure and feel it vibrating, it's a passive radiator, and it's creating sound. And we know from tuning that if you have a bump in your response that's 15, 20 dB down, even if your, bulk response is smooth, you can a lot of times hear that. It'll poke up and you're like, what is that ringing? I really kind of dove into how do I get rid of resonances? And I'm doing some stuff now that I can honestly say I don't know of anybody that's ever really tried it. And I'm not going to go into any detail on it right now, other than if I told you, you'd be like, you're crazy.
Okay.
So, but I'm really starting to get some good results on it. Obviously, when you do something kind of crazy, it creates a whole bunch of other problems, but I'm slowly working those out. And I've had some litmus tests. I had a friend come over who is he owns a pro audio store. And I'm like, hey man, you got to check this out. I'm finally like, I think I might be onto something. And he came over and sat in the driver's seat, and I was firing up some music, and I don't remember what was playing. It was just in the background quiet. And he kind of turns to me, he goes, it's like, what witchery is this? And I'm like, all right, I'm kind of, and we listened to some things. And at that time, it had some definitive flaws, but I've since ironed those out, and it just keeps getting better and better. And you know how car stereos, oftentimes, you have your demo songs that sound good, and then there's those ones that you're like, it just makes your system sound bad, and you track forward.
You put some cellos on there, and all of a sudden it's
exactly. It's like I had this list of tracks, and I started playing them, and I'm like, okay, that's a good one. Okay, that's a good one. That's a good one. And all of a sudden I realized I was putting like every track that I was listening to on my demo list. And I'm like, all right, well, this sounds really, really good. So anyways, I'm going to get back on the for the first time, get on the competition circuit. And I plan on hopefully unveiling this at SVR. I'm doing a lot of crazy install stuff, with my background in automation. I'll just say I'm going to do some crazy install stuff. So hopefully it all comes together by then. I've been working probably about the, last 6 months on this, sound concept for my front stage, and I'm finally at the point of making some finished products after hours and hours and hours of prototyping and trying different stuff and all that stuff. So I'm excited about that. We'll see where it goes. I might go home with my tail between my legs, and well, that didn't work.
You never know, right?
But you never know.
Until you stack it up, yeah.
Right. So during that process, I was also paying attention to a lot of the newer tuning stuff that was going on. I remember JL Audio really started putting out these videos that were a lot more in depth as far as, how to tune, this, that, and the other thing. They're talking about phase and transfer functions and all that stuff. And I remember someone in the comments saying that, well, I use a, Scarlett 2i2 and the smart audio program measurement program by Rational Acoustics. And I remember Steve Teresi, I don't know if his poker face gave him away, but there was a little something. You could feel like something big was coming from JL. And it was a short time after that, they announced Max and all that stuff. And Max had its own array. And I really started deep diving into kind of the array thing. I didn't want to spend the money to buy a Max. They weren't even out yet.
Right.
The
were
shop I was working at.
Yeah,
right. The shop I was working at, they're like, oh, I'd get one. And he had one of the Audison pieces, the Bit Tune. Yeah. And I was starting to dig into that because they really realized, hey, we better up our game. And they opened up the software, kind of redid the software. And that kind of, stayed in California when I left there. So I was like, well, I want to get into this measurement. I don't have access to that really anymore. So I started reading about arrays, and I got into stuff that, I started hearing about this guy named Dr. Earl Geddes, and I started I watched Aaron's interview of him, and I started paying attention to, this whole mic array thing. It was during that time I watched the smart tutorials, the V8 tutorials that I think came out during COVID.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn like the theory behind, how those measurements work and all that stuff, that, it's like I think a 13 episode series they put out. I would highly recommend anybody watch that, because what you will come out with is a very good working knowledge of what you're actually doing or why you're doing what you're doing. And it all, kind of comes around full circle when you actually start taking the measurements. It just makes a lot more sense. Back to the mic array thing, I'm like, well, I want to figure out how to do this. And I, came across Earl Geddes' paper that he put out in the 80s when he worked for Ford Motor Company. It was called the sound power method. And he talked about how he found a better way to measure interior acoustics in cars. He was primarily working on noise control, but he found there wasn't good correlation between how they were doing measurements at that time and what people actually perceived. So he wanted to, what he did is he already knew, based on another study that they did, where people's heads were in a car. They had done studies on where the instrument cluster was located. And so by, basic head geometry, he was able to correlate that to where most, people's ears were located when they're sitting in the car. And he took, basically his experiment consisted of taking 18 measurements around that area and dB averaging them together and looking at the average of that. It's kind of his baseline. And then he went and saw, well, how many, at that time they were taking one measurement, doing all the math, the statistics that measured all together. And he wanted to streamline that. So he's like, well, how many measurements can I do? And how do I do them to reduce that, to speed things up? And he found that in the correct geometric pattern, he could reduce it to 6 microphones and still be within plus or minus 1 dB of his reference averaged curve. And what he also found was amongst those 18 measurements that he had taken, once he got above the Schroeder frequency, the measurement could vary by as much as 10 dB, with just a few inch movement. So, he could clearly see why what, people were hearing wasn't correlating with what they were measuring. Because you move your head a little bit this way, that way, or the mic a little bit, you're going to get a completely different measurement.
Right.
And I had always struggled with that with tuning. I had gone through all the different mic methods, single point with noise, single point with sweeps, graduated to the moving mic method, and it was always inconsistent. You'd see, it looks smooth on the graph, and you'd hear peaks. And then you go remeasure and you're like, that looks nothing like what I measured
Every time I do this, it's something completely different. And
exactly.
This is supposed to be the consistent thing, not my ears.
Right. So I'm like, the first rule of measurement is if it's not repeatable, it's not valid. And I know that more than ever when I'm dealing with lab balances that
especially in your current line of work.
Yeah. They have to be able to measure 1/10 of a milligram over and over and over again and still be accurate. So, or consistent. So I'm like, I went on this quest to find the most repeatable measurement that I could. And, I was asking online, what about this? What about this? And, certain people, large personalities, that some people just take for the gospel truth, said, just choose one and go with it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do it that way. I want to come up with, a way that's repeatable. When I was talking about the design or how to aim the mics, they just said, just choose one and go with it, be consistent. I'm like, I don't want to adjust my, target curve to an array that doesn't measure right. I want to find an array that visually and audibly corresponds to the target curve.
Sure.
And I worked on that and kept trying different things. And finally, based on Earl Getty's research, based on doing a lot of reading about microphones, free field measurements, pressure field measurements, the other term I can't remember, but different types of fields and measurement techniques in them, I came up with an array that seemed to work pretty well. And I'm like, this is consistent. I can take it out. And I had since gotten a subscription to Smart, and I was using it. And I'm like, wow, this is kind of correlating. And I started showing some people online, and they're like, hey, can I get one of those? And at the same time, I was learning how to use my 3D printer, much more in depth, and learning the software program I was using and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, I could probably do this. So I kind of sent them out a little bit, a couple people, and got really good feedback. And Andrew Slater, I sent him one of the earlier ones, and I asked him, gave me some feedback, and I said, this is a direct quote from him. He says, I love it. Makes a super smooth sound. The mics fit tight and perfectly. It's super easy to set up and get repeatable measurements. I can go back and measure later and not have wildly different results. Very nice. And I'm like, all right, I'm on to something. So I've since made a couple tweaks to them. The geometry is based on the more or less the geometry of what Earl Getty lays out in his paper. There's a 30-degree downslope built into the base of the array. What's different about my array is the mics lock into position. I originally had it very adjustable, and I realized that there's too much adjustability in this. I need to take some of it out. It needs to be adjustable where for different cars to fit on the seat, sure. But the actual mic array portion of itself, I don't want to have adjustable. You just pop your mics in, bottom them out in the base, snug the set screw up, and they're in the exact position they need to be. I also, it's an upward facing array, kind of using that 90-degree angle. I did, after some reading and experimenting, I also actually tilted, instead of having the mics the full 30-degree forward, which would, be perpendicular to the base of the array at 30 degrees down, or the 30-degree down angle, I tilted them back about 10 degrees. So the net is about a 20-degree forward tilt on the tip of the mics. And that kind of gives you a balance of 90 degrees towards your front stage in general. And I found that really worked very well. As far as the target curve stuff goes, Aaron's commented a lot about how he doesn't like the target curves. He doesn't get it. And on the extreme ends, there's absolutely on the top end, if you're using wide bands versus tweeters, on axis versus off axis, absolutely, you got to tailor that. But where they don't really change a lot is in the mid range. Pretty much all of them are flat from, I would say 200 hertz on up to about 2-3K, somewhere in there.
Right.
It's more of being able to, what I use them for is setting up the drivers for level matching in that crossover area transition. The top end, you got to, adjust for your certain installation, but those transition from mid-range to tweeter and, your mid to your mid bass, that's always pretty similar throughout most of those. Mm-hmm. So it's a good way to kind of give you a guideline to match those up. So you don't, if you just EQ your mid and then you EQ your mid bass and you realize that the levels are so far out of whack when you go to sum them together, the target curves helps you not get out of whack when you're doing that. Sure. The mic array's gone well. It's adjustable for just about any headrest. It's the width of it. You basically just measure the width of your headrest. You adjust the clamps to that width. It's real easy to do. I use some 2040 aluminum extrusion with T-nuts. It allows you to slide that back and forth. Andrew was joking the other night that it has a gangster lean, built into it if you want.
He likes to have his off to the side, right?
Right. He actually was posting that picture. And I'm like, the gangster lean. That's going really well. I have sold probably, a couple dozen of them. There's a guy in India that has one. There's a guy in Pakistan that has one. There's a guy in Great Britain that has one. There's a guy in Germany that has one, and several throughout the United States. So, and I've all gotten really good feedback. The one critique I had was from a gentleman he does pro audio stuff by day, and he's got some of the expensive Semco mics or whatever, and he made the comment. He's like, I wish the tip on the set screw didn't put a little nick in my mic, because he's dealing with like a $300-400 mic.
Right.
And I'm like, well, you can get brass thumb screws and whatnot, and they make set screws that have little rubber tips on them. And or you could that so they don't mar surfaces, or you can burnish the tips. So on your, you just got one of my arrays for as a sample. You'll notice that I burnished your tips for you on those set screws. So you shouldn't,
looking at it right now.
as long as you don't over tighten those, it won't. It shouldn't nick your
Yeah, I see
mics
that
up.
now.
So,
Yeah, I didn't notice that till you said
yeah,
it.
they just really, they just really need to be snugged. The fit is tight enough that it's designed for the ECM 8000s or the Dayton mics. They fit in there really nicely, so it just takes slight pressure to hold them in place. And you just bottom them out as far as they go, and then just snug them up, and it automatically locks them in that array. So
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah, and then you just set it up. What I do is sometimes I just eyeball it, but the way I kind of designed it was you take a string and put like a nut on the end of it, tie a nut to the end, something with a little mass, and make like a little plumb bob. And you sit in the car and have a piece of tape, and you kind of take that string and with a nut on it, and you hang that nut, kind of like right between your eyes or your nose, and you tape the string to the ceiling so it hangs there. And that's your marker for where to approximately put the center mic. And you just adjust from there. The mic, the array has some up and down fore and aft adjustment. And then the triangular part of the bass, the bottom of that, you just set up parallel with the floorboards of your car. And that's going to lock it in at that 30-degree down angle. And you just go from there. And, you'll find that every time you throw it in the car, your measurement's going to look pretty much the same as it did the last time, within reason. You're not measuring in a laboratory. So it's worked really well. Biggest difference I've noticed versus other tuning techniques I kind of alluded to before with the mid-range, where things would sound peaky, things would,
Right.
and you throw you take a measurement and you're like, it just doesn't sound right, or it looks completely different. And now when the mid-range looks smooth on the graph, it actually sounds pretty smooth. And when you put the array back in and you take another measurement, it looks the same as it did. So I'm really happy with the way that it's turned out. I think the people that have gotten them are too. So I saw a post, someone put a post on one of the SQ forums that said, if you had $1,000 to spend on your system, what would you spend it on to make the most improvements? And people are throwing, I get this piece of gear, I get this piece of gear, I get this piece of gear. I have a totally different take on that. Take $500 or $600 of that money, buy a subscription to Smart LE, buy a handful of Dayton or Behringer mics, shameless plug for my mic array, get the mic array,
Right.
and then pay yourself, take the rest of the money, $400, and pay yourself $50 an hour to learn how to use it. And put a day in on learning how to use it and really learning how to tune, and that will pay dividends far beyond any piece of equipment that you could add to your system for $1,000 in terms of sound quality.
No, for sure.
So
100%. Yeah, especially when you're talking about electronics and stuff. If you're upgrading from what you already have and saying, well, if I go from this to that, and I'm going to make this multi-$1,000 upgrade, especially obviously you kind of have the stuff to start with to be able to do it and do the tuning and have stuff out of the way to where you're not having to. There's certain things you can't tune around, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, and once you're to that point, if you aren't doing your own tuning or you haven't got to that point of more advanced tuning, and your decision is between, do I upgrade my amps or do I learn how to tune and get the proper gear to do that? Obviously, the tuning is going to take you a lot further.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, experiment with your install. That's one thing I noticed. Most of the sound SQ installs these days kind of follow the same. Let's do some A pillars. Let's do some, mid bass. But they're always kind of the same architecture. And I can tell you, I did an experiment about a year. Oh, it's probably about a year ago, where I mixed in some automation and actually made some motorized speaker panels that allowed me to, adjust the angle in real time after, playing around with Smart and everything and the real time tuning. Like, well, what if we could, listen to the speakers in real time, make some adjustments to it? And I quickly learned that what you think looks good or what looks like it should sound good, it is not really where it sounds. It's not right. I think when you just throw speakers in where they look good, you're probably leaving 50% of that speaker, what it's capable of, on the table.
Yeah,
and that sounds like a lot,
experimenting with it, knowing, yeah.
Right, and I've spent literally, I think I mentioned to you probably a couple hundred hours in the last, year working on my front stage. And the single biggest thing, you kind of mentioned it before, and I was going to bring it up and I kind of forgot, is those resonances that I was talking about. It doesn't matter how expensive your equipment is, if you have $12,000 Accutons or whatever, you can't get rid of those. If those are there, they are going to color your sound.
Right.
And when you start to strip that back and can get rid of that, that's when you can throw on a cello playing with a piano with all their own natural harmonics and hear the harmonics of that instrument instead of hearing the harmonics that are and the muddiness that come along with a panel or a wiring harness or whatever behind the panel that is resonating with it. And it just starts taking a veil off the music, and you see more black between the instruments and all those the terminology that all the audio reviewers use. You start thinking that kind of stuff.
But for sure, I mean, it's just that contrast and the dynamics that are improved that create that difference that people oftentimes think they're hearing in between different equipment that they're probably not.
Yeah.
Whereas in this case, you actually are.
Yeah, I started, when I was thinking about the resonance, I'm like, well, is there a way to quantify that? Is there a measurement for, for like resonant distortion and stuff? And I just started doing some Googling. And again, hats off to Aaron for doing some of the interviews. Because one of the first things I found when I started doing some of that search was Aaron interviewing, what is the gentleman's name? He used to work for KEF. He was a long engineer for KEF and THX. Laurie Finchman, I think is what his name is. And it was an interview. Yeah, in his interview, the first 20 minutes of it was all about cabinet resonances and how great of extent they went to at KEF to eliminate cabinet resonances because they had such a huge impact on the quality of the sound. And they even went so far as they separated the magnet from the from the speaker itself and mounted. They had the magnet mounted in a jig, and then they had the rest, the basket and voice coil and cone of the speaker mounted in a baffle, and then they aligned them so the motor structure was actually completely decoupled from the basket itself. And, to completely eliminate kind of the equal and opposite, reactionary force.
Right.
And putting that into the baffle. And, they did putting accelerometers on the cabinets it was just crazy. And if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, some of those interviews are nitty gritty nuts and bolts and learn a lot about how that kind of stuff works. Those interviews that he does with Earl Geddes and this gentleman, and he does one with the gentleman from Harman as well. His name slips my mind. Floyd Toole, yes. Yep. And you can glean so much information out of that. I've listened to the Earl Geddes one probably 3 times, and his explanation of distortion, human perception of distortion, it's incredibly eye-opening, and you realize that we're doing a lot of stuff wrong. And we're focusing on a lot of stuff that doesn't really matter and kind of missing a lot of the stuff that does matter when it comes to sound quality. So anybody that wants to learn, man, go listen to those and listen to them again, because you will pick up a lot of stuff that is going to make a difference in the quality of your system.
Oh yeah. Well, especially when so much of car audio, from the brands to competition down, is also anecdotal, and there's so much out there, and the same is true for home audio too, or so much of audio. It's so necessarily subjective in obvious ways. You can't take a picture of. I mean, yes, there are obvious things that you can be like, oh, that's not going to work, but you can't necessarily go by any visual and declare exactly how you're going to feel about that in your environment, in your install, whatever. So it's kind of like, well, this guy is successful and he used XYZ, so I'm going to use XYZ because maybe I have the most chance of being right.
These guys talk about, Earl Geddes specifically in his explanation of distortion and how much of a mystery it is as far as human perception. There was a gentleman on a little while ago who had the 5-watt turn-on thump, and he was saying, I don't even listen to music at that volume, and why are they taking distortion measurements at that? And there's a couple different ways to logically speak through that, but one of the things that Earl Geddes brought up is he said when you do perceive distortion at high volume levels, the distortion is largely masked. With compression drivers, they were actually able to play them at very high volume levels with 20% distortion, and the volume level masked that distortion. On the flip side is when at low levels, people could pick up distortion levels that were in the 0.1%. Yeah. So it's incredibly, when you see an amplifier that at 5 watts is putting out a lot of distortion, and that's usually where they are higher distortion. They can actually get lower distortion, as they go up in power to the point of clipping, and then all of a sudden they skyrocket.
Right.
But that's, when you see an amplifier that has a lot of distortion down there, that's, you might kind of hear that, and that's where most people listen. You get a 90 dB 1 watt 1 meter speaker. Well, guess what? 90 dB that's when OSHA says, hey, you got to wear earplugs.
I was saying, and
so
90 dB continuous is quite a bit. I mean, if you have to listen more than that, but also I think part of it too is just how much. I mean, it's been interesting to me from the competition side of things, going from, I would say that, especially 4 or 5 years ago, the extremes between how Mecca was getting judged versus Emma in Europe is judging. There's a good 15 dB swing there in terms of how the cars are tuned, because they're being tuned at a lower level or higher level. And levels itself is such an interesting topic to me in competition, because I think, as much as with the tuning techniques over the past, I'd say 10 years or better, phasing has got locked in a lot better and everything else. With that becomes the tools that we have now over the past few years, such as the array that you're discussing in that. I mean, I think that helps where that sweet spot isn't so locked in. But the idea of competitors seating the judges and making sure that they're in the right headspace and everything else and getting all that just right. But then the judge might be listening 5-10 dB off from where they've been tuning at, and that level difference, just in terms of like back to the target curve, all that's thrown out the window at that point. And I feel like as a judge, when you're judging at both those levels, when you're judging at a high level in that 90, 95, 100 plus dB range, you start judging with your feelings more than what you're hearing. To me, you're judging the visceral effects of how it's affecting your body more than what you're actually hearing.
Yeah, I can see that. I can definitely agree with that.
And when you're listening at that lower 80, 85 dB range, like what Emma does, especially in Europe, like your brain goes into a different mode of being more hypervigilant in what it's listening for. It's like, oh, I gotta pick this out. I really gotta listen, and I'd say it's similar to when you're listening to somebody in a speech or something, and all of a sudden they get quiet, and then all of a sudden you're listening. Like, you would think that them yelling most people yell and then they listen, but it's when you get quiet and then you start listening. And I think there's a lot of stuff together with that. But again, on the eardrum side, even like I have an ear that I've had 3 blown eardrums in one ear.
Ooh.
So, I'm well versed in damage to ears and everything else. But yeah, I mean, when you have that, you're much more sensitive because the eardrum's not working right. So you're much more sensitive to volume and differences and that distortion level when it hits, because the eardrum's just not working right. So it hits those distortion levels and it's very audible. Your brain obviously knows what's happening. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it makes total sense that we would not be able to pick up on those distortion rates at a higher level, because again, your eardrum's already stressed out to that point where it's not really going to know the difference. Yeah.
Right. One other thing that I found very interesting that he said in his interview with Aaron is, in his working at Ford, he was also heavily involved in their audio systems, and this kind of loosely correlates with some of the stuff that's going on online with the amplifier measurements and everything, and how all these amplifiers that are supposed to be super clean and everything, they have some interesting distortion patterns in them. And he's like, people like a certain amount of distortion.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
He said when things are ultra crystal. Yeah, exactly. I love tubes. Hint, hint. When people hear a system that is clinically distortion free, they're bored with it. Mm-hmm. They tend to not. It just doesn't sound good to me. It doesn't seem like it gets loud. And he said that distortion, them picking up distortion, directly correlated with people thinking the system got loud. And when you played something at the same dB that was ultra clean, to them, they didn't perceive it as loud. So there's so much stuff you can glean out of those interviews. One little snippet, I remember I've watched some of Nick, and you were talking about butchering my last name. I don't even want to. Nick Acapella Cicella or whatever, Apicella. Sorry, Nick.
Apicella is the correct one.
Apicella.
Acapella too.
So I was purposely trying to butcher his name.
I know.
Because people do it to mine all the time. But he was asking Brian Mitchell, in his interview, he's like, well, why are your tweeters pointed down a little bit? And it went back to, I think Scott Buwalda did it in one of his cars too, where his wide bands were angled up. And it's kind of the same reason that the mics in my array are kind of angled up. It's when you put things at more of an extreme angle on one axis, it reduces the impact that having them off axis in another, or a different axis on a different plane. So like if I'm looking at my speakers, well, one, if I have mic aimed straight forward, and I look at the left speaker, it's at like a 15-degree angle, and I look at the right speaker and it's at a 60-degree angle. But if you point the mic up, you look at the left speaker and it's 90 degrees off axis, and when you point it, you look at the other speaker, it's 90 degrees off axis. And Brian had done kind of the same thing with his tweeters. He had pointed them down a little bit, so they were the response was more symmetrical. They were both equally off axis from the listening position, and he made the comment, A-pillars, tweeters on top. When we did kicks, tweeters were on the bottom. And Nick asked him, well, why did you put tweeters on the bottom? And Brian's like, I don't know, it's just what we did. But I picked up on that, and I'm like, we know now that the reason that they did that is because the lobing, where the phase summation was proper. Back then we didn't have CNC. Most guys were making kick panels with a jigsaw, and they're all on the same plane. So acoustically, the tweeter was in front of the woofer, and when you had it down low, that would tilt the lobe up. So your summation was up higher. And if you put the tweeter up high, it was even worse, because then where the phase summation was good was, pointed at your feet.
Right.
So anyways, I just picked up on that, and I'm like, maybe I can shed some light on that. But,
no, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it because, when was the last time that we were putting tweeters in the kick panels? But yeah.
Right. Well, it's funny you mention that, because the last big stereo system I did for myself was in 04. I had a 240 SX. And I had kicks in that. And it was, the tweeters were down low. I had like some ScanSpeak mid-ranges, and it was the first time I kind of played around with some aperiodic enclosures in the doors. Had flip out Eclipse 7-inch flip out that played DVD audio. And I was like so adamant. I'm like, I want this DVD audio. And the brain on this screen was bigger than most amplifiers these days. So it went in the back, and it just had front, rear, and sub pre-out. So that went into some EQTs and some audio control, or some PPI, PSC 221 phase shifters.
Ooh.
And I wanted to do everything analog after this piece, because I didn't want to lose that 2496 resolution. And that it actually sounded great. Interestingly, I had some Alto Mobile Class D amplifiers. They were full range Class D amps that Steve Rogers was the rep for at the time. He's like, Eric, check these out, man. Because at that time nobody had full range Class D. It was all sub amps. And it was Alto Mobile was a European company, I think Germany based, and they were in the pro audio world, and they decided to delve into car audio. And, those amps, I'm like, wow, this sounds really good. And those amps were probably pretty high distortion.
Right.
So
back on
it's kind of, right. I still have those PSC 221 phase shifters and they're kind of fun. I have two of them, and I threw them on Smart because I wanted to see what they actually do, measure the transfer function. And they are an analog all pass that you can adjust how much effect they have, how much they shift the phase, and they're centered from about 100 hertz up to about 800 hertz. And so you had this sweeping phase adjustment,
kind of fundamental mid-range
knobs.
Yeah,
and that's where they were effective. They were like a focus control. Back then I wasn't going to use time alignment. I just flipped the polarity on one of the mid ranges, and that kind of snapped things kind of in the center. And then you took those PSC 221 phase shifters, and it was like a focus on a camera. You just play with those, and the image would just kind of snap into focus. So I might still play with those again a little bit, just because they were fun, and I like analog knobs. So,
it's fun.
Yeah, it's fun. One other thing you had mentioned, when things are quiet, you really have to focus in on the sound. I found very much, you're in that dark place, and you just close your eyes and listen to the music, and when you can really pay attention to it. And that's one of the things I'm so excited about with what I'm doing with the audio system is the soundstage layering and the separation between instruments, is getting to a point where it's so good that I can, just really visualize stuff. And the stage has gone from two-dimensional to, stuff that's, there's some tracks, mostly electronics, where I got stuff dancing around my head, and there's someone way out on the hood, completely focused, singing along or playing an instrument. So
wow,
it's cool. I'm excited about it, and we'll see.
very cool.
Time will tell. Yeah. So, when I head out to SVRs.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing it for sure. Hopefully, people can get some demos and see what's going on, see what you've been cooking.
Yeah, people are gonna think I'm crazy. That's all I'll say.
Well, we're all a little bit crazy, so that's okay. You're in good company for sure. I don't think there's anybody that's sane in this. So
right, I had when I did my first automated speaker panel, I had someone who's an industry vet say, "Well, that's cool, but is it really necessary?" And yes, I learned so much from it. That's kind of what sprung this whole project. Mm-hmm. I thought to myself, I'm like, is anything that we do really necessary?
None of this is necessary, I promise you.
There isn't a car audio related topic that is life or death. So
go back to your
then we make it.
Yeah, go back to your first system with a shaft radio and a 4x6 in the middle of the dash and call it a day.
Right. Those passive radio. And man, if you saw that system, oh my goodness.
I think we've all been there, man. It's okay.
Yeah, just thinking about it, I had, just a couple of quick stories, because I know we're getting up on time.
No, you're good. The
first subwoofer box I ever built was I had sheet of particle board, and this was for 2 15-inch Rockford subs, right? I wanted to build a ported box, and I had my Ford Fairmont, and it's according to the port tuning nonogram that Sound World had, I needed to build 4 cube per sub and tune it to 40 hertz, which was like a 2-inch port or a 4-inch port, 2 inches long in this size box. And my dad was in sewer and water, and we had some 4-inch PVC pipe laying around, so I used some of that. And anyways, I cut this thing out with a jigsaw on the front yard, and I think it was kind of cold out. So I went in my mom's living room and proceeded to assemble an 8 cubic foot coffin for 2 15-inch subs in the living room. I carpeted it, and I hadn't carpeted it at that time, but I had a job washing dishes. Mm-hmm. And my hands were so covered in liquid nails.
Oh no!
And that had dried while I was assembling this. I'm like, I got to go to work. And literally I could hardly bend my fingers. So I drove to work, and I get there. And the first 10 minutes I'm there, I'm literally taking the SOS pad and scrubbing liquid nails off my hands. But
fantastic.
Somehow the best part about that box is it wouldn't fit in the trunk, obviously. I built it to fit in the back seat. So I had this giant subwoofer enclosure with 2 15s in the back, and had just enough room for one of my friends to sit next to it in the back seat. And we used to roll around, cruise with this thing with someone squeezed in the back and a couple other guys in the front, rocking out. One other quick story. When I was building that box, I didn't know at that time whether I was supposed to wire 2 8-ohm subs in parallel or series. There's no YouTube videos, there's no this, that, and the other thing. I didn't really understand Ohm's law at the time. I was 16 years old, and I'm like, it was like 1 a.m, and I was in my garage at my parents' house, and I first wired it in series, and at that time we didn't have mono amps. We bridged the amp, and I'm like, wow, it's kind of loud. And I'm like, I'm going to try it the other way. So I end up wearing the subs in parallel, and it's, again, mind you, 1 a.m, and I turn on the music, and it's just like boom, boom, and I'm like, this is awesome.
Right.
Well, my parents' bedroom was right on the other side of the firewall in the garage. Mm. And I'm rocking out for maybe 30 seconds, and I turn it down to hear my dad. He had opened the garage door and is screaming at the top of his lungs, turn that shiznit down. And I look over, and he's in nothing but his tidy whities, screaming at me.
Scarred for life.
I'll never forget it. My dad was known for his tidy whities. That's a whole nother
funny.
Rabbit hole. But I kind of I was just like, this is so cool. And just kind of to bring that full circle, it was about a year ago when I first delved into this. I'm like, I'm going to try something. with some speakers. I'm like, this is totally unorthodox and I'm going to see if it works. And I remember firing it up and having like that same level of excitement when I heard what it did. Granted, my dad has passed away and he wasn't there in his tidy whities, but I could hear him screaming, like turn that shit down. And I had that same
level of excitement.
Yeah, the same level of excitement. So
that's awesome.
Anyways, that's, I could sit here and tell stories all night, but we got lives. So
yeah, details
outside of car audio. Yeah.
So in the interim, I'm sure the majority of people who are heavily involved will meet you at SVR, but if somebody is interested in one of your microarray setups, how do they get a hold of you for that?
Right now, at this exact moment, you can just hit me up on Facebook, Eric Ekern. I'm trying, it's been on my my list here of to-dos to get some sort of online store set up so it's a lot easier for people.
Sure.
They'll, there'll be a few options. They just click what they want, boom, 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 and it just makes it real.
Nice.
Internet store.
Right.
Because right now it's kind of a process of contacting me and I explain things and blah, blah, blah. But
right.
Yeah, they're pretty reasonable. I'm not trying to make a ton of money on them. I just want people to, benefit from them. I'm at the point in my career where I really, I've mentored a few young guys along the way. And, it feels good to do that, to help give back a little bit to these guys. Because I was that age, none of us came out of the womb knowing any of this stuff. We knew how to, go to the bathroom in our pants and, get fed by our mom, and that's about it.
Right.
So, if I can give back, teach a little bit, like, Steve Rogers did with me and Greg Mitchell did with me and, a zillion other people did with me over the, the last 3.5 decades, that makes me happy. So
awesome. Well, I appreciate your time and your expertise and your rabbit holes that you've gone down on this. I mean, I think it's really cool what you've put together, and I can speak from personal experience so far. I mean, as far as the array setup, it's the workmanship and the materials and it's substantial. I mean, I was actually surprised.
One quick comment on that. The one I sent to Germany, the gentleman initially said, or no, I'm sorry, it was the one that's in Britain. He said, I wasn't expecting it to be so robust. And he's like, but then when I started realizing that I'm putting 7 mics in this and the cables that hang off the mics,
right,
all of a sudden there's some weight there.
Yeah.
So every part that is weight bearing is metal reinforced. Obviously there's some 3D printed parts that have bolts that run through it.
Right.
And I've had absolutely no failures. I send a couple extra pieces of hardware in case someone strips out a T-nut. That's one thing you don't want to do. Nothing on that array needs to be, you don't have to put your kung fu grip on it. Right. Things just need to be snugged up.
Right. And
it holds, position. And once it's set up, it takes literally, 10 seconds to take in and out of the car. And if you were going to, if you have it set up, you have a shop or whatever, the next time you want to use it, you just pop it in, tighten the clamps, maybe spend another 10 seconds adjusting the angle of it, and boom, you're ready to go. So
right.
You don't have to worry about mic angles, any of that kind of stuff.
Because it's all
it's
cooked in there. Yeah. Very cool. Well, I'm sure we'll have some follow-ups on that one as my journey progresses, as yours has. And we'll go from there. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks a lot, Clifton.
How about the ones we especially like?
Which ones?
The ones with the cars that go.
I hear you. Hit it.